This is Flatiron, known for the fashion, its food, and the iconic Flatiron building.
There is one thing that is hiding in plain sight that doesn't seem to belong here, and that is a cemetery in the center of Manhattan, which also happens to be one of the earliest Jewish burial grounds in America.
This is the third cemetery of the Spanish-Portuguese congregation called Shearith Israel. And in this video, I want to show you the story behind these graveyards, which in short is the story of the earliest Jews in America.
And I'm super excited to be here with someone who knows so much about the earliest Jewish burials of New York City.
My name is Zachary Edinger. I am the Shamash, or the Ritual Director of Congregation Shearith Israel. And this is one of our 3 historic and 1 active cemeteries that I maintain for the congregation. Why don't we go inside and take a look?
We'll see the oldest Jewish burial ground in America, which became the site of a Revolutionary War battery, the remains of one of the smallest graveyards in the city, and visit the graves of some very important people in Jewish American history.
Hi, if you're new to this channel, let me take a moment to introduce myself. My name is David, and here on Yiddishkeit, we talk about the experience of Jewishness. Now, personally, I like to do that by looking at Jewish history, culture, and art. And this story of the earliest Jewish cemeteries in New York is such a great way to capture all of these elements. In particular, I am fascinated by the earliest generations of Jews in America, and of course, the legacy that they left behind of establishing Yiddishkeit in America. So I'm really excited to take you on a tour of the earliest Jewish burial grounds of New York City right now.
To start our exploration, I've come to Chinatown, to this corner known as Chatham Square. Here, sandwiched between a few buildings, is the remains of the oldest Jewish cemetery in America. Up until now, I've only seen images of this cemetery online. I've visited the outside of this cemetery, but I've never gone in. And in fact, there's this video online of some guy climbing into the cemetery and taking footage from the inside. But I'm very excited that we won't have to resort to that, since we will be going into the cemetery with our very own tour guide. As I walk towards the cemetery, let me tell you a little bit about the background of the first Jewish community of New York. New York City was first established by the Dutch, although they called their settlement New Amsterdam, and the name we have would come later, and we'll get to that. The moment in the Dutch colony that is of most interest to us is 1654, when 23 refugees from Brazil would arrive with little money and in debt to the captain that brought them from the Caribbean. The governor, Peter Stuyvesant, wanted to make them leave as he did not want to support them financially. But the Jews appealed to his bosses in Amsterdam, and they were allowed to stay, and they were also sent other Jewish merchants to help support the community in 1655. After this initial success, the Jews needed to continue to petition Stuyvesant for additional rights, like the right to be part of the militia, to open a kosher butcher shop, and to open a Jewish cemetery.
The earliest Jewish burial ground in America was opened somewhere in this neighborhood in 1655, probably to the south of the cemetery. Governor Stuyvesant had allowed the Jews a little hook of land situated outside the city, which was to serve as a burial ground, although none of that original cemetery remains.
In 1664, the British demanded that the Dutch surrender the colony, and shortly thereafter took over the city and renamed it New York. The British would go on to rule the city for over a century until 1783, when they lost the Revolutionary War against the colonists.
Under the British rule in 1682, a member of the Jewish community named Joseph Bueno de Mesquita purchased this land behind me to serve as the Jewish burial ground.
Start with the oldest grave. This is the first burial known in this cemetery. It dates from 1683. There's a Benjamin Bueno de Mesquita, who was the father of the person who bought the land for the congregation, who was Joseph Bueno de Mesquita. So he has the honor of being the oldest burial. This is also the second oldest gravestone in all of New York City, extant. I mean, people lived and died before him, but there's only one gravestone known to be older than this one in New York, and it's in Trinity Church. The cemetery was purchased in 1682. He died in 1683.
When this cemetery was first purchased, the city of New York looked something like this. And in fact, this location was actually outside of the city. And so the cemetery that we see today preserves a tiny glimpse into a much older New York.
It was also on top of a hill, which you can sort of get a sense of when you look around, that the ground level of the street is below the ground level of the cemetery. And that's because this was the original height of the land, and that was graded lower, because we're on the top of the hill, and there was no road here when this was first purchased and used as a cemetery. So this is the grave of Gershom Mendes Seixas. Gershom Mendes Seixas was the Chazan of Shearith Israel during the American Revolution. He was the first Chazan of the congregation who was born in America. Prior to him, all the Chazanim were born in Amsterdam or Curacao or London. He was the first who was a native New Yorker who had trained with his predecessor, whose name was Yosef Yeshurun Pinto. He was a mohel, and he performed weddings, and he did all the functions that a rabbi might do in a small community. But he was the Chazan. There were no rabbis in America until the middle of the 19th century. I mean, there were people who had smicha who came through, but there was no function of rabbi in any of the communities of America until around 1840. Communities were led, and to this day in Shearith Israel, the Constitution requires the community to have a chazan, a shochet, and a shamash, no rabbi. And so he was the chazan of Shearith Israel. He was the minister. He did all the functions that a community would need, performing weddings, performing funerals. If there were matters of halachic import, they would be sent to Beit Din in London, usually.
I see.
But for everyday functions, he was the guy. And he was one of many brothers. And so one of his brothers is buried right here. This is Benjamin Seixas. Benjamin Seixas was a veteran of the American Revolution and also one of the signers of the Buttonwood Agreement, which founded the New York Stock Exchange. Another brother of theirs was Moses Seixas, who lived in Newport, Rhode Island, famously wrote a letter to George Washington, to which George Washington responded with the famous words that this country gives to bigotry no sanction.
Ever since I first learned about Gershom Mendes Seixas, I've wanted to come here inside the cemetery to see his grave and pay my respects up close.
He died in 1816. Napoleon had recently conquered in the Middle East and had gone into Egypt and to what we would call Israel. After those victories, it became popular in Europe to have these kinds of obelisks.
Interesting.
And so this really reflects the era that he passed away in 1816.
Wow.
When there were patriotic feelings of revolution against the King of England, he was a strong patriot. And he did something that none of his predecessors would ever have done, which is to preach the American cause in the synagogue. He is known as the Patriot Rabbi. Although he was not a rabbi, he was the Chazan of the congregation. If you look this way, today you see buildings and the East River is pretty far away. But when this cemetery was active in the 18th and early 19th centuries, this was overlooking the East River. General Washington and the Continental Army, during the American Revolution, actually placed cannon in the cemetery. Exactly where, I don't know.
In March of 1776, one of Washington's generals wrote to him about the preparations happening in New York. A battery for this purpose is planned at the foot of the Jews' burying ground. To protect this battery from near approach of ships, guns and barbet placed on the heights of the Jews' burying ground, in correspondence with a battery on an opposite commanding knoll in Long Island, will certainly be sufficient. But in reality, this battery was not sufficient, since the British took the city of New York at the start of the Revolutionary War in 1776. Anyone who was allied with the Continental Army had no choice but to flee.
When the British took over, it is said they had a factory for making cannon right near here, and that they picked up the lead epitaphs. You see these originally had some lead epitaphs in these stones, and there's more of them that were moved to 21st Street, where the lead was just taken out and supposedly used for cannon. So some of the cannonballs that were used by the British may have come from here.
Being at such a crucial juncture in American history, Rabbi Seixas' impact has been honored by the Jewish American Hall of Fame. This is a project which honors an influential Jewish person each year, And in 1975, an artist named Goethe Wiener created this medal, which on one side has a portrait of Rabbi Gershom Mendes Seixas, and the other side has him leading the congregants out of New York during the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, holding ceremonial items. Most notably is the Torah scroll.
During the American Revolution, when the Continental Army, led by George Washington, fled New York after the Battle of Brooklyn, he, along with most of the congregation, fled with them, on their heels, so to speak. And he took with him the silver objects and Sifrei Torah of the congregation and spent the war initially in Connecticut and later on in Philadelphia for the duration of the war, while New York was the capital for the British. There are 18 veterans of the American Revolution buried in this cemetery. On Memorial Day, we have a ceremony. I invite you to come. I think you'd like it. And all of your viewers too. It's open to the general public on Memorial Day. And we have a color guard and a whole ceremony where we decorate the graves of those veterans of the American Revolution. But this is the grave of Jonas Phillips. Jonas Phillips was a very interesting character and a very important person in American Jewish history. He came from Germany as a young man as an indentured servant. One step up from being a slave. And he worked for several years to work off his debt. And then eventually, when he did, he became free and moved to New York and became a businessman in New York. He marries the daughter of the Chazan in New York, whose name was Machado. So he's an Ashkenazic Jew who marries a Sephardic woman, and he becomes very involved in the New York community. He also had many children who survived to adulthood, I think more than 20. And so today, in the congregation, there are descendants of his who are still members of the congregation. Many, many people who come to visit this cemetery are his descendants. As the shamash, when I get a request to visit the cemetery because someone says, oh, my ancestor's buried there, invariably it's going to be either Jonas Phillips or Benjamin Seixas. Benjamin Seixas had 18 children who lived to adulthood, and I think he had 20 or 21. And he is also a great patriot. And so when the revolution comes, he also flees and goes ultimately to Philadelphia during the course of the war, where he remains for most of his life, till the end of his life, when he finally moves back to New York at the very end of his life. He was in business. He would import goods that he thought would be popular to sell here. And so when the war breaks out, he writes to Amsterdam, to his suppliers or his agents, to say, send me these different supplies, they're going to be useful. And in the letter, which is written in Yiddish, he essentially summarizes or paraphrases the Declaration of Independence. Whoa. And the ship that was going to Amsterdam never made it. It gets captured by the British. And the British, to this day, on one of the archives in London, have this letter from Jonas Phillips in Yiddish describing the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. He wrote letters to George Washington and other founding fathers urging them that in the new country, the new United States, there should be no religious test for office. Unbeknownst to him, the Continental Congress had already determined that that would be the case. In New York, most of the period that we're talking about, even in the colonial British days, Jews could swear on a Hebrew Bible. In Pennsylvania at the time, there was a religious test for office. And by that I mean, in order to be the mayor or the senator or the congressman from whatever district in Pennsylvania, you had to swear on a Christian Bible. So he wanted to make sure that the new United States wouldn't have any such laws.
As we mentioned, the earliest Jews in America who came in 1654 were descended from Portugal. And so the first congregation of New York, called Shearith Israel, follows the Sephardic Nusach, which means the Spanish-Portuguese version of the liturgy.
These are Sephardic Jews who fled Portugal, who had lived as Anusim and B'nai Anusim, as conversos, fled mainly to Amsterdam beginning in the 1590s to re-openly become Jewish again. Because they are a diaspora community, having fled their homeland, they kept up the Portuguese for generations. And like I say, that even in London and Amsterdam, there are still remnants of it today.
However, as we saw with Jonas Phillips, over the colonial period, Jewish people would come from other places, including Germanic countries.
This congregation, by 1730, was half Ashkenazi.
The fact that community members had a mix of several identities, from Portuguese to German and, of course, Jewish, the leaders like Gershom Mendes Seixas had to take that into account as they thought about the future of Yiddishkeit in America. And nothing would do more to shape this than the revolution. We can see that in the moment when the British leave New York and the community invites Rabbi Gershom Mendes Seixas to come back to his hometown.
After the revolution, he had been the Chazan in Philadelphia. They asked him to come back, which he agreed to under certain conditions. And one of the conditions was that the congregation no longer use Portuguese. Until the American Revolution, the congregation took its minutes in Portuguese and announced the honors of the Torah service in Portuguese, who would open the ark, who would lift the Torah. All that was done in Portuguese. Some of the gravestones are in Portuguese. Most famously, the prayer for the government was in Portuguese, and that was for King George III. After the revolution was over and they invited him to come back, he said, I don't want to use Portuguese. I don't understand Portuguese, or I barely understand Portuguese, he said in his letter. The identity of the congregation kind of changed with the revolution, and that's indicative in that letter. No longer are they Portuguese Jews in a British colony, they are American Jews.
It's customary to recite some Tehillim, the book of Psalms, over a grave, and I chose to recite Psalm 16 because of the following verse. For the sake of the holy ones who in the earth are interred, and for the mighty, that all my desires are fulfilled because of them. This line always reminded me of Gershom Mendes Seixas, who went through some of the most important events in Jewish history, and we still benefit from that today. So I'm not sure why we don't talk so much more about this generation that lived through such an important moment.
Rabbi Seixas was truly a pivotal figure in establishing Yiddishkeit in America. In fact, he was one of the clergymen who attended Washington's inauguration, which was held in New York in 1789. And he was also the first Jew to be on the board of Columbia University.
He answered the call of George Washington to celebrate the first National Thanksgiving Day, and he developed a ritual service for that day, including reciting Psalms of Hallel. And to this day, we have a Thanksgiving Day service that is largely based on his 1789 service.
Wow.
I love this stone. This is a man named Moses Levy. He was a fabulously wealthy trader, late 17th, early 18th century, here in New York. He was born in Germany, moved to London with several of his brothers, and then came to New York. He became the Parnas Presidente, the president of the congregation, and was the president of the congregation when they purchased the land for the first synagogue building in 1728. He dies the next year before the synagogue is completed. But he is really one of the prime movers of that synagogue. What's really amazing about this stone, which is a little hard for you to see today, this stone has three languages. You have Hebrew on the top, you have English on the bottom, and then you have Portuguese in the middle. This is an Ashkenazic Jew who has Portuguese on his gravestone. I always think that's quite amazing. It really represents the kind of mixed up identities that this community had in the early 18th century. And only after the American Revolution did they sort of coalesce as American Jewry. He also has this really great English part, which is a little poem called O Frail Atom. What man surely produces, death by his power reduces. Thy heavenly parts, man being fled, alas, the other parts are dead. So it's a little thing about how his physical form is here, but his soul has fled to heaven. But it's a really great little poem. His brother has an entirely Hebrew gravestone in the 1720s or so. This one entirely in Hebrew. It would have been unlikely that this was made here. Not impossible, but unlikely that they had the skilled stonemasons to do the Hebrew work here in New York. So this is also probably imported from Europe, London or Amsterdam. And it has a whole poem, which is hard to read now. This is a Hebrew epitaph composed in America in very early period. This is the grave of Walter Jonas Judah. And Walter Jonas Judah was a medical student or a young doctor in 1798 when there was a terrible yellow fever epidemic in New York City. While most of the people who lived in New York fled to get away from the disease, he stayed and he helped tend to the ill. Unfortunately, he contracted yellow fever and he died of it. And so a stone was made by his brother, and the stone is really quite elaborate. We have no other stones like this. In Curacao and in Amsterdam, they have many stones like this, this is probably made in Curacao or in Amsterdam and brought here. This is the angel of death, the Malach HaMavet, spreading disease over the city of New York. This is the city of New York. And this is a tree, you could say the Eitz Chaim, or you just say a tree, and it's being cut down in the prime of its life. So he was a young man who died young, I think in his 20s. And so this is a symbolic of a young person who died before his prime. And so it's really full of this kind of symbolism, and it's an amazing, amazing stone, and he's an amazing person.
In 1823, the city passed an ordinance which prohibited burial below Canal Street, which meant that
the cemetery was no longer used. The extra land that went down towards the East River was sold off because they couldn't use it anymore. There were one or two burials where families, wealthy families, wanted their loved one to be in the old cemetery, and they just paid a fine to the city for it. But really, that was the end of the use of this cemetery.
in 1855, as the city was expanding, the road to the north of the cemetery, called the Bowery, was extended southwards, creating St. James Place, the street we see today.
Some of the early she'elot that were sent to Europe from New York had to do with disinterment of bodies. One of the instances where that happened was right here. The original cemetery went actually far across the street. New York City decided to extend the Bowery down to Lower Manhattan and make this St. James Place, and took part of the cemetery, about a third of it almost, by eminent domain.
This caused the Jewish community to have to move 256 graves into the new constraints of the cemetery.
But this was a much larger space than you see now today. This is a smaller remnant.
The Jewish community would have to seek another burial ground. But this was not the only time that something like this would happen, and so to see that, let's go further uptown. This is the West Village. And as we head to the second cemetery on 11th Street, we're actually passing this beautiful brownstone home around the corner from the cemetery on West 10th Street.
This is the home of the great niece of Gershom Mendes Seixas, named Emma Lazarus. And you might recognize the famous line in her poem, which goes like, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free."
When Emma was growing up, this was already considered part of the city. Today, it's right next to Washington Square Park. However, during the yellow fever epidemic in 1798, this area was still on the outskirts of the city. As a result of the outbreak and the large death toll of the disease, New York City would create the first Board of Health.
One of the rules that they promulgated was that no one who died of a communicable disease could be buried below Canal Street. This is below Canal Street. So the congregation bought a second cemetery, now is located on 11th Street, but that was originally for people who died of communicable diseases.
When it was originally purchased in 1805, the cemetery on West 11th Street was used for this purpose. It wasn't until 1823, when the first cemetery at Chatham Square was put out of use, that this became the primary burial for the Jewish community. However, this wouldn't last very long, since in 1829, the city would once again take land of the Jewish burial ground to extend a road, this time West 11th Street. You see, the earliest settlement in Manhattan, which was the Dutch, was formed around the natural shape of the island. But now, the city was expanding so far past that, and so in 1811, the city ordered the Commissioner's Plan, which drew a grid over Manhattan, which we know today. Although there are some distinct differences between the original plan and the city grid today, like the addition of Central Park, the plan drew West 11th Street straight through the second Jewish burial ground.
So in 1829, the city paves West 11th Street, which you can see behind me, and it cuts through this entire cemetery, leaving just a tiny triangle that we see today.
Additionally, in 2009, a car accidentally hit the wall, damaging it and leading to a restoration effort of the cemetery. I was actually here a few years ago in 2022 when they were still doing repairs, and here are some of the photos I took. Here are other photos online of the restoration. And today the effort is completed and the cemetery looks like this.
And what's so cool is you can see along the gate outside the cemetery, people have left little stones, and I think it's so special I want to leave a stone of my own.
Even though this cemetery was only in use for a few short years, and is one of the smallest cemeteries in the city, it still has some notable burials.
Ephraim Hart, who was also a veteran of the American Revolution and also a signer of the Buttonwood Agreement that formed the New York Stock Exchange. So he's buried at 11th Street. And so I don't go every year, but some years I'll stop by and decorate his grave and say a memorial prayer for him too, because why should he be left out?
As a result of the drastic reduction in size of this cemetery in 1829, Shearith Israel would have no choice but to seek the third burial ground, which takes us to where we started in Flatiron.
This cemetery sits on 21st Street, right off of 6th Avenue. It was opened in 1829, the very same year that most of the cemetery in the village was removed. There was a time in the mid-1800s when this area of Midtown was the heart of the Jewish community of New York. You see, as the cemeteries moved more uptown, so did the Jewish community, until Shearith Israel settled in its current location on West 70th Street. The first building of Congregation Shearith Israel was built in 1730 in Lower Manhattan, which I like to call the Old City. But in 1860, they built their fourth iteration on 19th Street, which is just 2 blocks from the cemetery. One of the people buried here in the third cemetery of Shearith Israel is Mordecai Manuel Noah. He was a descendant of Jonas Phillips, who we saw in the first cemetery, and he was a politician in New York and later appointed by President James Madison as the consul to Tunisia, and became involved in many Jewish causes, including famously the failed idea called Ararat, which was a Jewish refuge in upstate New York, and later on he would become the champion of the idea of Jewish return to Palestine, becoming seen as a proto-Zionist.
Just like the first 2 cemeteries, this one was also put out of use when in 1851 the city once again prohibited burials, this time below 86th Street. And so Shearith Israel had no choice but to seek out the fourth and current burial ground. So let's go check that out to wrap up our tour of some of the oldest Jewish cemeteries in New York.
This is Beth Olam. It's part of Cemetery Belt, which is a strip of land in the center of Brooklyn and Queens, which has several cemeteries. The cemetery is the burial ground for the first Jewish congregation, Shearith Israel, that we've been discussing, as well as others like the second congregation of New York called Bnei Yeshurun.
So as we come into the cemetery, you can see this structure behind me, which is the building where you can be metaher yourself, which means to purify from the ritual impurity of a cemetery. Basically means to wash your hands. And this building right now is out of service, but the structure that remains here is actually quite interesting because it was designed by a man named Calvert Vaux. And what's interesting about him is that he designed a lot of places you may recognize, like Central Park, the Museum of Natural History, the Met. And for myself, being from Brooklyn, he also designed Prospect Park, and there's a park in Bensonhurst that's named after him. So it's interesting that this structure was built by a very famous designer and architect, and it's said to be the only structure that he built for a religious organization, which is the cemetery here at Shearith Israel.
One of the interesting things about this cemetery is that it sits on the actual border between Brooklyn and Queens, which separates the top and bottom of the cemetery. So right now I'm in Brooklyn, now I'm in Queens, now I'm back in Brooklyn, back in Queens. Yeah, it's kind of trippy. But let's get serious. I'm here to pay respect at several graves of the descendants of people we saw in Manhattan, and I think that would be a wonderful way to bookend their stories. First up, we have another descendant of Jonas Phillips.
Right here, that's Uriah Phillips Levy. He was the first Jewish person to ever be a Commodore in the US Navy. And what's famous about him is that after the death of President Thomas Jefferson, Uriah Levy bought his residence called Monticello and maintained it. In fact, Commodore Levy wanted his grave to have a life-sized statue of his likeness. That's not the style of this cemetery. You'll see a lot of obelisks. A lot of them have similar cloth draped over it, but I don't see any statues of humans. So instead, there's the obelisk we see today.
In fact, in Philadelphia, there's a statue of him outside the synagogue called Mikveh Israel. Commodore Levy essentially fulfills the effort of his grandfather to allow Jews to hold such a rank in the armed forces. And Uriah Phillips Levy would leave his own legacy, and we can see that in a nearby monument.
This giant obelisk with the eagle on the top of it is the Hebrew Civil War monument here in Salem Field Cemetery, down the road from Shearith Israel. And in a second, I want to take you closer and show you the plaque and read it. But I think that Uriah Phillips Levy would be quite proud of this monument and what it means. It says, "To the memory of the soldiers of the Hebrew faith who responded to the call of their country and gave their lives for its salvation during the dark days of its need, so that the nation may live." Another person who is buried here is Benjamin Nathan Cardozo, who was a United States Supreme Court Justice from 1932 until his passing in 1938. He was the great-great-grandson of Gershom Mendes Seixas. In fact, he had his bar mitzvah in Shearith Israel back in 1883. Another descendant of Gershom Mendes Seixas, who we already mentioned, is buried right here, named Emma Lazarus. She was the great-granddaughter of Grace Seixas Nathan, who was the sister of Gershom Mendes Seixas. And Grace Nathan was a poet and went on to influence Emma, who became famous for that. Although Emma Lazarus is most known for her poem that is engraved in the Statue of Liberty, her work stretches far beyond that, and there are many very powerful and very Jewish poems in her collection, which I recommend you check out.
Being the descendant of the Portuguese community of New York, she lived an upper-class life during a time where penniless Jews were migrating to America. And as her famous poem makes clear, despite her differences in class, she still identified with her fellow Jews. In her poems, you can see how she connects her own life as part of the larger story of the Spanish and Portuguese diaspora, and farther back still to ancient times in Judea.
As we come to the end of our little tour of the earliest Jewish cemeteries in America, I thought it was appropriate to reflect on the idea of Jewishness, particularly through the lens of Emma Lazarus. And so I brought a selection of her poems, and I'd like to read you a small section. "O deem not dead that martial fire, say not the mystic flame is spent. With Moses' law and David's lyre, your ancient strength remains unbent. Let but an Ezra rise anew to lift the banner of the Jew." Reading these poems really influenced my sense of Jewishness, really influenced a lot of what you see here on this channel, and so I'm really grateful that I get to be here and pay respects to someone that really influenced my sense of Jewish identity, or in other words, my Yiddishkeit. If you're still watching, I want to thank you for being here to the end of this video. I've wanted to visit some of these graves for such a long time, particularly Gershom Mendes Seixas and Emma Lazarus, so I'm really happy that I was able to do that and take you along with me. I also want to thank Rabbi Edinger for taking his time and effort to come out, let us into the cemetery, and share a lot of his knowledge with us. I also want to thank my friend Mayor, who was there to film that interview. If you're interested in Jewish graveyards, then there are links below which help me on my journey and will help continue your exploration. In the meantime, if you're interested in Jewish history, culture, and art, then you, my friend, you're in the right place. My name is David, and welcome to Yiddishkeit.